The puddles were gone, and everyone had disappeared. The colors of the room were dull and gray, and the intense silence of the environment was deafening. "Hello?" Eddie called hopelessly. He swallowed hard and rose to his feet. He looked more closely at the couches, as if eyeing them intensely would make the others reappear. They didn't. A giggle made him nearly jump out of his skin. It had come from the back of the apartment room, where Eddie recalled Rod's bedroom was located. He stared down the hallway where a closed door stood. Sweat pooled under his armpits, and his breathing quickened. He turned away from the door and pulled it toward the exit. He tugged at the doorknob, but the door remained shut. He pulled aggressively, praying that it would eventually fling open with enough force. It wouldn't budge. "Fuck!" Eddie shouted.
"You'd really leave without saying goodbye?"
said a familiar voice. It had come from the bedroom again, and, if he wasn't mistaken, the voice belonged to Yasmin. "Yasmin?" Eddie called out in confusion, and he slowly walked down the hallway. Yasmin didn't speak again, and Eddie grew uncomfortable. When he reached the door, he stuck his hand out to grip the doorknob. Before grabbing it, however, he lifted his hand up and knocked gently on the door. "Yasmin," he called again. "You in there?" No answer. He sighed, sweat forming on his forehead. He closed his eyes, trying to calm his nerves. He reached for the doorknob again and turned it. With his shoulder, he slowly pushed the door open. Yasmin was sitting on the bed, her head down and her dark brown hair shielding her face. Her hands rested on her thighs. He cautiously approached her. "Yasmin, are you okay?"
"Nobody's watching,"
she replied, and Eddie froze. "What do you mean?"
"We could do whatever we wanted back here, and no one would say anything."
She lifted her head and stared into Eddie's eyes, revealing pitch dark eyes that made Eddie's body turn cold. She was smiling, but her gaze felt sinister.
"Wouldn't you like that?"
Eddie stepped backward and tumbled to the floor, and Yasmin followed him with her eyes without blinking. She didn't move. Eddie crawled backward out of the room and stood quickly. He slammed the door and turned his back to it, breathing heavily. He dashed back into the living room and yanked at the door again, but it was as if it was locked from the inside.
"It won't open, Eddie,"
a voice said from behind him. Eddie turned to see Rod staring back at him on the couch furthest from him. His eyes were the same as Yasmin's and the little girl's. "What is this, Rodney?" Eddie yelled. Rodney didn't answer. He simply sat and stared, a terrifying grin on his pale, gray face. He was motionless, and the awkward silence made Eddie feel more anxious.
"You asked to be here,"
a voice said from the hallway, and Eddie's head spun quickly to look for the source. Rachel stood in the dark, arms drooping by her sides like bodies hanging from nooses. "No!" Eddie shouted. "No, I didn't! I didn't even want to come to this damn party!"
"You sat in the circle,"
said another voice, and Eddie turned to see Garrett sitting in the wooden chair, which now faced him. His large size would ordinarily have been enough to make Eddie unsettled, but his eyes and his smile felt more threatening. Then both Rod and Garrett rose in unison, eyes fixed on Eddie. They slowly approached him, and from the sound of dragging feet to his right, he could tell that Rachel was moving closer as well. "Stop!" Eddie cried out. "Stay away from me!" They didn't obey. Eddie's eyes bounced from person to person, everyone advancing towards him like zombies. Eddie closed his eyes. "Please go away. Please go away. Please go away." There was a giggle that once again echoed in his mind. It was the little girl. He was certain of it. He fell to his knees, his eyes still closed. His lip began to quiver, and his eyes burned. Please don't kill me. Leave me alone." Nothing happened. After a few seconds, Eddie cautiously opened his eyes. Everyone was gone. Eddie rose to his feet, his heart still racing.
"That shit really worked,"
Eddie heard Rod say, but the voice was far less unsettling and abnormal. It sounded far away. Eddie walked down the hallway again.
"Is he gonna be okay?"
Rachel cried. The voices sounded like they were coming from Rod's bathroom.
I don't know.
Rod shouted.
I wasn't really expecting it to work."
The bathroom door was shut. A part of Eddie was worried that the voices belonged to the demented creatures that seemed to wander the hell he was in. But they sounded different. They were more genuine. He opened the door, and a glowing light was coming from Rod's mirror. He approached it and was stunned when his reflection was not what he saw. In the mirror were the others, frantically searching around the room.
Ah, man. That shit ain't cool, Rod.
TJ said.
There's no way he just disappeared like that.
Well, then where did he go, TJ?
Rod asked, stopping his search to glare at TJ. TJ had no answer. He looked down at the floor.
What do you know?
Courtney said.
It actually worked. Pretty dope.
This isn't dope.
Jasmine shouted.
He could be in danger, Courtney.
You knew that was a possibility when we did this stupid ritual.
Well, none of us were actually expecting it to work.
Rod snapped. He kicked over the small table in the middle of the room.
God damn it! Eddie! Eddie, where are you?
Rod?
Eddie yelled.
Rod! I'm here! I'm right here!
Eddie! Can you hear me?
Yes, Rod! I don't know where
He can't hear you, Eddie.
Voices said behind him in unison. Eddie froze, staring blankly at the mirror. The others faded away, and he was stuck looking at his true reflection. Behind him stood all of the others, eyes black. Blood ran along their cheeks as if they had been crying. Their smiles were wide and their teeth unusually large. Everyone towered over him, staring down at him like prey. No one moved. Everyone, including Eddie, stood completely still, waiting. Their eyes never looked away from him, and Eddie was too afraid to take his eyes off of them. He didn't want to turn to face him. What the hell were they? Eddie knew that the rooms typically had their own sort of tone, but that tone was non-existent. It was deathly silent, and he felt like he could hear his own heart beating. Why weren't they moving? They were like mannequins, pale in color and paralyzed. They stayed motionless for what must have been 5 minutes, and then he remained like a statue just like them.
Playtime.
Playtime's
over.
They all finally said. And then they lunged. In the mirror, Eddie watched as they dove straight into his body, climbing inside of him and invading him like viruses. His chest began to ache, and his head pounded. He clenched his fists as his arms throbbed. He put his palms on his forehead and screamed in agony. His entire body felt like a fire had been lit inside of it. The voices came together in his mind and laughed maniacally. Eddie shouted, and his body burst. Blood spattered all over the room, forcefully splashing against Rodney's face. He had to close his eyes to prevent it from going into his eye, but it landed inside of his mouth. He recognized that metallic taste from when his teeth had fallen out all those years ago. Rachel screamed, and Rod opened his eyes. Everyone in the room was covered in gore, guts, and organs scattered across faces and walls. Rod was frozen.
What the fuck? What the fuck?
TJ was delirious.
This isn't.
Rodney knew what Garrett was trying to say, and he didn't need him to say it. Rachel vomited on the floor. Rodney looked down at his feet, and a piece of paper sat between his legs. Reluctantly, he reached down and picked up the bloodied paper. Words were scribbled on it, clearly the handwriting of a child. He read the words, and his right hand rose to cover his mouth. His eyes widened, and he let the paper slip out of his left hand. He backed against a wall and slid downward, his back streaking the blood that covered it. He sat on the floor, staring blankly down his hallway.
What was on the paper?
TJ stammered. Rodney rested his arms over his knees, and he couldn't bring himself to look at anyone. Instead, he stared at nothing.
Rodney?
Garrett said. His cocky asshole tone was completely gone.
It said...
Rodney swallowed, and his mouth hung open for a moment.
It said, thank you for playing.